Hey, I'm Kyle, and in this video, I'm gonna try and build a chair unlike anything I've ever made. Maybe unlike anything anyone's ever made. Trying some things that admittedly I'm not so great at, and attempting to win a furniture competition with this crazy out-of-the-box piece.
I'm sitting.
I'm sitting.
So this is actually the first big woodworking project I've made for a college class, and it's likely going to be the only one. I study something called industrial design. At this point though, it's basically just physical product design, and the curriculum is aimed at throwing a bunch of different types of challenges at you to learn a variety of different design skills, and one of them happens to be a chair project. Now, there's no stipulation that the chair has to be made out of wood, but, well, I'm a woodworker. So because I want to make the best chair possible, I'm going to use, at least in my opinion, the best wood possible, black walnut. The walnut I got was 10/4 or 2.5 inches thick, and about 9 inches wide, so it was a real workout carrying these things back and forth, over and over, taking shallow passes on the jointer. And I had to do this for 6 boards, all cut into at least 2 separate pieces, but after a few days, I had everything jointed and planed on their faces to 2.25 inches thick, and then I had to run them all through again on their edge. Now, I didn't actually start from the beginning. I've been doing R&D on this chair for a couple weeks, because as it turns out, chairs are pretty complicated. I did a bunch of sketches, mini models, and ergonomics testing, which all led to this prototype, made of 2x4s and a duct tape seat. You know what? This might be some of my best work yet. For now though, I'm just using the prototype for scale in order to sketch out some full-size templates which will help me plan out how to break down my wood. I cut down all the pieces and lay them out on top of the template. If it fully covers up all my lines, I know I'll have enough material to work with. Then I can rip them all to the same width and use an angle finder on my hand-drawn template to figure out what angle to set up the table saw in order to cut angles on all the pieces which will eventually be touching the floor. I can then go ahead and glue up all the individual pieces into leg blanks, and I do that with the help of some super glue. The most important thing is that this angled face stays flat. I can't have pieces coming misaligned and ruining that face. Everything else though is gonna get carved away eventually, so I make sure the edge is perfectly aligned before holding the piece in place with super glue, after which I'll add on the clamps. I repeated the same process for the front 2 shorter legs, only difference being that the angles were slightly different. Constantly checking by laying out everything on the templates lets me know that I'll have enough material to work with when I eventually get to carving. Most of the pieces could be aligned with the same bottom face and super glue trick, but there were also a few pieces that had to be glued on to the top half of the legs. Since these didn't have a face to align to like the bottoms, I instead used some Sharpie lines drawn across multiple pieces to let me know where to glue them together. Once I was through the grunt work of gluing up blanks, I could move on to the fun stuff, starting to shape them using those templates from before. To cut through this 8-inch thick walnut, I'm using the behemoth bandsaws my school has, or maybe they just feel huge compared to the one I have at home. When I cut 3-inch thick softwood, the blade would bend like a rubber band, so I thought there'd be at least a little deflection, but to my surprise, the cuts were perfectly square. I then take the legs to the prototype to check their scale, marking how far in they go, and realize that the back legs end way closer to the center compared to the front ones, so I just cut and glued a couple more pieces on. Structurally, this is insignificant, but because I was designing the template for the center joint piece where all the legs would intersect, I thought this would balance out the design better. So this is basically the shape of the chair blank before any carving, and this X-shaped joint is going to connect everything. Only problem is that to make this, it has to be split this way, split the other way, and each section is also multiple pieces stacked together. To make those pieces, I'm throwing together a really simple table saw jig using some angles I pulled off of the paper template I made of the base. I also cut an angle on every single piece which matches up with the angle of each leg. That piece goes into the jig, and I screw in a scrap piece to apply holding force so I can safely run this through the table saw. I need to cut multiple to stack on top of each other, each one getting progressively larger, but I still need everything to align on this edge, as well as this one, which will both be flat joint faces I'll need to glue to later. So I keep running pieces through, taking off slivers at a time until everything lines up perfectly. When I stacked all the pieces up onto my template, they left this little section, as well as this one empty. So I had to scrounge around in my scrapwood pile to find some chunks large enough to fill in those gaps. With the gaps so small and my scrapwood pile so big, you would think that it would be easy, and yet I really struggled to find some pieces with the right grain orientation. I know that this is unideal, but they didn't have any boards wide enough at the lumberyard. You work with what you got. With everything out of the glue up, I had to clean up the mating faces for a clean joint. The best way for me to achieve this was by running everything through the jointer once or twice, keeping pressure against the fence for a square cut, which was fine for the big ones, but I made sure to be extra careful running the little ones through. I then cut a matching angle onto the little additions before another glue up. And get ready, because glue ups are going to be a trend going forward. To have the smoothest, strongest glue up, I'm marking out and cutting in some domino mortises. I'm probably not going to own one of these personally for a very long time, so I'll take any chance I can get to use one now. I also cut a few little sections out of the backs of the pieces, which would all get removed later anyways, to act as spots to add clamps during the glue up. Because of the dominoes and thinking ahead for clamping up this very irregular shape, this glue up was actually one of the smoothest. Another thing that really helped me were these quick clamps. Unlike F-style clamps, the feet don't swivel on a ball joint, and they have these really grippy rubber pads, meaning I can put them on slightly slanted shapes and they'll still work pretty well. Once it was out of clamps, I got really excited because I got to use the tool I've wanted to own for a very long time, the Festool track saw. Turns out the design makerspace has had this tool for years, yet no one has ever asked to use it. Being a space for students, most people come in asking for help, and we have a panel saw as well as a saw stop, which have covered their needs so far, but to be honest, I'm not sure this is the best way to do what I need to, but I just wanted to use the track saw. If you can think of a better way, let me know in the comments. I need to cut through about 6 to 7 inches of wood to make another perfectly flat and square joint face to glue to the other half. The only saw I know that can cut that thick is the bandsaw, which leaves a really rough cut. Instead, what I came up with was cutting as deep as I could with the track saw, then removing as much as possible on the bandsaw without going over my track saw cut. I then very tediously remove as much as I can with a belt sander until it's as flush as I can get it to the track saw cut. And then the scary part, running it through the jointer. Cutting end grain on the jointer is never a great idea. It's bound to tear out and can be unsafe if not approached with care. But I ran this through so slowly and with such a shallow cut, and the tear out isn't an issue since I'll be carving it away anyways. Thankfully, it went fine and had a pretty good surface finish because of the helical cutter head, so I just threw some more dominoes in each half before gluing those halves up. Once again, the glue up went surprisingly well, but this definitely wouldn't be the case forever. Finally, it was time to move on to something a little more interesting. More glue joints with more dominoes, but they're different this time, because this time they're bigger. In all seriousness, making bigger dominoes, or more accurately floating tenons, is actually far more complex, meaning custom jigs, and in this case, custom angled 3D printed jigs and a templating bit in a plunge router. For the shorter legs, this was pretty straightforward. Using some double stick tape, I could align the same template on both pieces just by flipping it upside down. But when it came to the other legs, I ran into a problem. So this is the center joint. If we zoom in onto one face, we can see a cross section of the joint. This would be the easiest tenon to cut. Only issue is that after carving, there's a chance I could expose it. So this would be the safer way to make the joint. The problem with this is that I would have to make a flat surface for the router, and it'll hit the wood before going far enough, which I learned the hard way. I could make the flat portion bigger, but then the router wouldn't go nearly deep enough. This would be a big problem if the tenon was actually this big. In reality, it's more like this, so rotating it or not doesn't really make a difference. This is one of those times where my overcautiousness tends to make things unnecessarily more challenging than they have to be. The whole reason I'm even making custom walnut tenons is on the off chance that I carve into them later, the mistake will be easier to hide. The thing is, these failsafes are nice to have. It's good to be cautious, but in cases like these, it ends up adding way more difficulty and complexity to something that is really quite simple. These are the kinds of skills I think make a great woodworker. I find it's hard to teach concepts like this, matters of judgment, but skills like this separate the good from the great, and they can only be learned with time and by making mistakes. Thankfully this time, the mistakes didn't do any lasting damage, they just cost me some time. You would think the way things have been going that after the joinery is cut, I'd glue some more parts together. But before that, I'm actually going to do some things that'll be easier before the glue up. Starting off with drawing out some more templates. I can then trace out the lines onto the legs. Some of you more keen-eye viewers might have noticed that earlier, some pieces looked kind of funny. That's because these events are a little out of order, but I thought they would make more sense put together like this rather than sequentially how it actually happened. Either way, it doesn't really make a difference because the reason I'm doing this is to bulk remove as much material as possible before the glue up, while I can still reach into every angle a lot more easily. I started with this cordless Milwaukee angle grinder, which I'd used previously the first time I power carved, but I guess I was way more aggressive this time since it overheated the battery almost immediately. After switching it out, that one died pretty soon after, so I switched to this corded Makita one instead. This absolute beast, paired with the extreme Kutzall disc, hogged through material like nobody's business. So much material that seeing it on the ground as sawdust pained me to throw it away. But anyways, now we're back up to speed, and I've moved out onto the lawn to do the rest of the carving because of how messy it was. At this point, I'm just removing most of the weight, still staying about 1/8 of an inch proud of my Sharpie lines as I get my bearings freehand carving. I also tricked one of my friends into carving a chair with me. She's never done it before, so little does she know what she's gotten herself into, but I can't lie, it was nice to have someone to work late nights with. I came back the next morning to finish up some of the carving on the legs before I moved on to doing the same thing for the center joint. I wanted to run it through the bandsaw to get off as much material as fast as possible, but in order to do that, I needed to cut some 2x4s to stick onto the bottom and make a flat surface to run it through upside down, where I could clearly mark out the lines for cutting on the flat bottom side from the template I made ages ago. I also cut a little bit off from the extra pieces I stuck onto the front two legs. Because this is end grain, cutting off even a little bit here is going to save me so much time carving. To prep for final glue up, I also cut down what would be the loose tenons for the joinery. This was one of those times where taking it slowly, shaving off a little at a time leads to a perfect fit. What these allow me to do is align the legs exactly where they will be, and mark where I can safely remove the material off the sides with the bandsaw, once again saving me a ton of time carving. Nevertheless, there was still a decent bit of carving left to be done before gluing up. This area specifically, the bowl shape in the center, is way easier to get into before the legs are glued on. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity of heavy carving, I could glue up the front two legs. I had faith this glue up would go well. As I had planned ahead, I had a tenon to align everything, and the past few for this project had been fairly uneventful, but my planning, well, actually, it'll be easier to just show you. Before the glue up, I had routed in some little flat sections in spots that I knew I would be carving away later, in order to add some clamps to be able to hook onto this kinda amorphous shape. At the time, this seemed like a good idea, but I neglected to really think through how I would get those clamps on. After banging my head into the wall for a while, I tried supergluing a scrap piece on to give more space for the clamps to hook onto. But that didn't work either. Eventually, I wisened up and I just grabbed a really long clamp, and this simple solution worked way better anyways. This project felt different to me compared to some of my past ones. With most of my furniture pieces, I like to plan everything out, make a 3D model so that I can reference measurements and perfect all the proportions. I basically know everything I have to do from the start and just have to execute on the vision. But this chair was different. Its shape being so fluid and having so many subtle curved details, it wasn't even possible for me to model. Not only that, but ergonomics testing a chair unlike any other chair on the market from scratch, it forced me to put trust in my judgment like no other project before it. It reminded me of my favorite memories in the shop making shop projects, throwing together something that's half planned but going with the flow, having to trust yourself to just keep working and that eventually it'll shape up. That mindset is peaceful, usually because shop projects have no stakes. But now, with over $1,000 in materials and a competition on the line, I have to bring myself back to the way things used to be, and trust myself to go with the flow. And for the freehand carving portions, I gotta hand it to myself, I don't think I did too shabby, but when it came to the final glue up,
it was so slow.
It's kinda clogged. I can't
This
go.
is the big one.
No, it's almost done.
Yo.
What? What? Fuck! It's fine. It's fine. I'm fine. It's good.
What the fuck?
It's good. She's taking photos of me. These are like my shame photos.
No.
They're expose me that I'm not a real woodworker. I don't know what I'm
Put this in
doing.
your video.
No! I think I might. I'm gonna have to. That's fine. Just, okay, you guys wanna help me? It's perfect. It's a perfect fit. So, yeah! Okay, somebody hold. You know what? Wait, it's holding itself. It's fucking strong.
No.
Let's go. No, hold it anyway. Hold it anyway. That one. Okay.
I mean, if it works.
Yeah! I then had to set up a bigger workstation outside.
I'm losing it.
I want to give a huge thank you to my friends, not just for the free manual labor, but for helping and supporting me through all these projects. They're a huge part of why I work as hard as I do, and there's no way I could go through all the long nights in designing if I were to do it alone. Ever since I've joined this design program, I've been surrounded by so many wonderful and passionate people, and I can't ever see myself going back to doing this alone. But enough of that sappy talk. I still have way too much carving to do out back. People don't usually work out back behind the workshop, but people also don't usually power carve. Actually, as far as I know, I'm the first person to power carve anything at the school because when I asked them for power carving tools, I was told we had none. So the Kutzall discs, which I absolutely love using by the way, are my personal ones that I bought myself. Also, my professor going forth is banning all future students from hand carving their chairs because of the mess and, well, you'll see. But anyways, as for the carving itself, the principles I'm following are fairly simple. I very expertly lay out my lines, sometimes using my templates, other times freehanding, then carve up to those lines on the edges. This will leave both edges at almost final dimension with a huge hump in between them, which I can then slowly carve away to smoothly connect those edges. Eventually, I got the general shape down and can move on to some more subtle curves, starting by shaping the tops of the legs, and then adding what seems to have been coined as a fingernail style detail when done with a large roundover bit, where there's both a curve and also a sharp angled transition. But here, I'm doing it at a way larger scale and hand carving it to have a variable radius, so as the leg gets thinner going down, the curve also gets more extreme. I then wanted to get a head start on sanding, because with all those deep carving marks, well, saying it's a lot of sanding doesn't do it justice. But after the wind tipped the tripod over for the third time, I think that was the universe's way of telling me that this video doesn't need sanding footage. So let's move on to something completely different. I took my prototype seat template, scaled it, and sliced it into pieces so I could laser cut it out on a full-scale cardboard version. It was pretty easy to tape up the sections, then start tracing them out onto the fabric. And the reason I bothered with laser cutting is not only because it's more accurate, but more because of this. After tracing the outside, I can remove that outer edge, then trace the second smaller outline, giving me what's called a seam allowance. The only problem with this whole operation is that here I'm using faux sheepskin carpet as my fabric, which I chose because it has a luxurious feel that fits the design, and also because the fur can hide the seams between pieces, allowing me to sew a comfortable cup seat that looks like one piece. That's all great. The problem is that it's super weak when sewn together. I mean, I was able to pull the pieces apart by hand, but after some extensive strength testing, I found that all the fur was pushing the fabric apart, leading to empty space between the pieces when sewn together. That means that I have to go in with this hair clipper and painstakingly trim away all the hair around the perimeter of every single piece. Now, I have to come clean on something. That night, me sitting on the floor shaving fabric was when the project was due, and I knew I wasn't going to finish on time, but I thought that if I worked through the night cutting and shaving fabric, I could at least sew together enough to submit a picture to my professor. But back when I scaled my templates down for laser cutting, it turns out that the way I did it was wrong. Going from a prototype printed on paper and reinforced with duct tape, the conversion wasn't as simple as I thought, and in my rush, I didn't bother double checking the sizes of my templates. I don't have any more footage of that day, because to be honest, I was just crushed. All I have to show for my work is this photo I had to take, with the seat that's too big, poorly duct taped onto the rest of the chair. But even if I am behind schedule, I have to keep moving. I still have time to meet the competition deadline, which is the most important thing. If I can't work with fabric, I know something I can do: sanding. And there was a lot of sanding, because not only was I removing all the deep grooves from the carving disc with the help of a card scraper, I was also still shaping the wood, refining it to its final shape. With all the Festool tools this shop has, a Rotex sander was not one worth investing in, so I'm doing this all with this old pneumatic angled multi-tool and a little sanding pad, which, to be honest, was a lifesaver. I also had a few touch-ups to make, one being this little gap in the back. Back when I was scrounging for material, trying to make the most of what little I had, I happened to take a 16th more off than I should have on one section, leaving a gap. To fill it, I found a scrap of the wood from that section and cut a wedge, glued it into the gap, then trimmed off the excess and flushed it up. The gap also happened to extend to the top, where I sanded a piece to fit perfectly into that gap and then flushed it up the same way. I also got around to carving, I guess what you would call the feet. I had been leaving these large so they wouldn't break off while I kept moving it around, but the time had finally come to refine them down, starting with the grinder and then hand sanding in the details. I really didn't want to go back to the fabric after what happened last time, but I'd put it off as much as I could. There was no more woodworking that could be done before I made at least part of the seat. So I laser cut some new templates, and I actually checked their scale this time. Not once, not twice, I don't even remember how many times I checked it. I definitely checked it. With it confirmed correct this time, I cut out another copy of all the pieces for a total of 2, one front and one back side. Then it was back to shaving. I had to do this a couple hours a day for literal days, just for the 3 front pieces. In total, I eventually have to do 10 different pieces, but for now, just the 3 before I started sewing the front of the seat together. I'm not gonna pretend I know what I'm doing at all, and the fact that this is a tough fabric to work with really doesn't help, so I'm not gonna give any advice. You can see how slowly I'm going, how often I'm stopping to readjust, and because all of this took so much longer than expected, the little time I had until the competition deadline had come and gone, and I missed it again. I was overambitious, took on more than I could handle, and now I'd have to pay the price. Or at least, that's what I thought. As it turns out, I do this funny little thing where I don't read things carefully. So the website says, final deadline March 3rd, until April 14th, which means even with my terrible time management, it's not over just yet. I'm not going to take this time for granted, so for the past week or so, I'd been figuring out a way to attach the fabric to the wood seamlessly, and it starts by cutting a deep groove in the ends of the legs with this 4-inch long router bit. But even taking a pretty shallow pass, it was chattering a lot. Even taking 1/8-inch deep passes felt unsafe, so I had to resort to taking, I don't even want to know how many 32nd inch passes until I got as deep as I needed. A piece of metal was going to go in these slots, and I didn't have time to go to the metal yard, but I was lucky enough to find this huge scrap of angle iron in the thickness I needed, which I could cut down into 2 bars of flat stock. I then removed all the paint from them because I was going to use a metal laser CNC to cut out the plates I needed. I think it goes without saying that I didn't need to use a metal laser to cut out these fairly simple shapes, but it was so much easier, more accurate, and faster, and I don't have any more time to waste. I then had to hammer an ever so slight curve into them because when I cut the slots, I made the templates slightly curved because it looks just a little bit better. If you've been confused as to what these plates have been for and how they help attach the fabric, things will hopefully make sense here. I made 4 pieces, 1 for each corner, and they're laminated with epoxy onto the metal plates, which will then sew onto the seat, giving an extremely strong metal anchor point to the wood. After I had epoxied these fabric pieces to the steel, I took a little hiatus from the project. By this point, I was well into working on the next major project of the semester, and in classic Kyle fashion, I decided to once again design and make something extremely complicated. Before I knew it, the month had almost gone by and I needed one final push to get it done. And that one final push was named Catherine. We had been helping each other out with our weak points while building our chairs, and now she was going to help me with my actual big weakness, sewing, and help me finish the final stretch of it, which started by putting all 4 of the metal pieces into the respective slots in each corner, and then pinning all the fabric in place, which I did flawlessly.
My God!
We had to finish all of the fabric work in one night, and it's safe to say I was going a little insane, maybe from the lack of sleep because it was pretty late already, or maybe the stress of having to sew something really quite difficult as a beginner.
Bulging around me.
Yeah,
That's
it
great.
gets a little bit hard to like put the foot down.
It was probably more the latter since I had trouble sewing 2 layers together, so I knew 3 would be way more difficult. And soon enough, the thread broke and it just started pulling apart.
Ah! Fucking again.
I couldn't backstitch over this entire span because of the thickness, which meant that I had to cut away everything I had painstakingly stitched, rethread the needle into the machine, and start all over again. Only for there to be even more problems. This time the thread got immediately tangled, leaving a huge mess. Maybe you caught it, but when I screwed up, I said again. This was happening every couple minutes. It was honestly really frustrating, but eventually Catherine figured out that a bigger needle would somehow fix it. I'm not sure how that works, but we got it done. We then just had to flip it inside out, and I could finally find out whether or not my chair would break if I sat in it.
Holy shit, it's time. It's time to sit. It's time to sit. Oh my god. I can't do it. I'm sitting.
No,
I'm
you're
sitting.
not. Lean backwards. Oh my god,
sitting.
yeah.
I'm sitting in my chair. Oh, it's comfy as fuck. Oh my, sit in my chair. Sit in my chair. Sit in my chair.
Let the break it.
I'm fatter than you. I sat in it.
I know that.
Oh my god.
I admit I can be a little overzealous when it comes to my projects. It sometimes leads me to take on more than I can handle. This time, a lot more. I almost missed the competition submission, which was over a month after I was supposed to have finished. I attribute my overambition to a few factors. Firstly, I have a really design-centric mindset. If you ask any of my friends, they'll tell you that I love solving design problems, especially mechanics and manufacturing ones. Once I come up with a design that I like, I feel that I have to see it through, even if it's way more difficult to do so, and more than that, I'm motivated and excited to work through those challenges. On the other hand, if I don't, I look back on my work with a tinge of regret, knowing that I could have done just a little bit more. And as much as I feel like I shouldn't admit it, I think it would be dishonest to say that my ego doesn't also play a role in this. When it came to my school's one and only woodworking project, I gotta say I felt the pressure a little more. Sometimes it can feel like I always have to be getting better, constantly one-upping myself, improving on the last thing I made, and showing how much I've grown, and if I don't, then I'll be left behind. But I can only improve my skills so fast. If not that, then the only other way to produce better work is to put in more time and effort. The thing is, that extra effort makes it extra rewarding when I actually succeed. I cannot express how amazing it felt to sit down in that chair for the first time, to have designed and actually built by far the most complicated thing I've ever made, a chair like no other chair on the market, from its hand-carved wooden frame to the fluffy seat that I engineered to hold the body in just the right way. And maybe I should better my time management and work-life balance, but I'm grateful to be able to pursue something I love with so much passion, and that my issue is that I care about it too much. If that's my problem right now, it's a damn good problem to have.